Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today I'm doing sort of a special video over what's recently become one of my pet projects or one of my pet interests, whatever you might want to call it. Recently, I've been very interested in taking down a whale of a land eel. Something that's in the maybe thousands of acres here in Texas is what I'm looking for. Something that I'll be able to subdivide sort of continuously for a number of years. um, and one of the most important features that I'm looking for in purchasing that property is water. Um, if you did not know, Texas is facing a pretty big problem, which is water. There are serious concerns that we may be in a pretty dramatic drought. I mean, we're already in a drought, but in a very serious drought where we are not able to supply our population by 2030. It's not really talked about. Um, and most people that I speak with don't really understand the gravity of the situation. But right now, we are seeing, I think, really for the first time since I've been here, these shortages actually affecting communities. I don't have the article in front of me now. I probably should have had it ready. But in Austin recently, I believe there's 4 or 5 subdivisions that are being built that will not have access to water. So that's kind of a big issue. This has led me down the path of learning more and more about water, our water resources, how they are managed and governed and created and moved from A to B. And ultimately, I'm just fascinated by the fact that most Texans can go into the kitchen or the bathroom or their faucets anywhere, turn it on, and get clean water without really thinking much about it and still having a relatively affordable water bill. So, um, in this video, I'm going to cover pretty much everything I could get my hands on as it relates to water. So, come along with me. Uh, the first thing that I want to talk about is lakes. A lot of the water that we are using here in Texas is being pulled from reservoirs. Um, and a fun fact is that in Texas, there's only one natural lake, and that's Caddo Lake. Caddo, I think is how you'd say it. That's out in East Texas. It's near the Louisiana border, and it's the only naturally formed lake in the entire state. It was created by a massive log jam called the Great Raft that backed up the Red River centuries ago. Today, it's a really beautiful cypress swamp and is protected from development. But outside of that, every other lake in Texas is man-made. So, starting in the early 1900s and especially after the brutal drought of the 1950s, Texas went all in on damming their rivers to create reservoirs to service all of the people that need water. But it wasn't just about water, it was about power, agriculture, flood control, and later on, real estate. So these lakes shaped entire regions and gave rise to some of the most sought after and valuable land in the state. So I wanted to cover a couple of the biggest lakes that were created. Lake Livingston out in East Texas, that's one of the largest lakes that has been made in Texas kind of by surface area. That was created in 1969 by damming up the Trinity River, and it's a key water supply for Houston and a hot spot for second homes and rural retirement developments. We got Lake Travis, that's in central Texas, and that's formed in 1942 with the construction of the Mansfield Dam, not far from me. It's part of the Highland Lakes chain, and it stretches over 65 miles. But what's crazy is how volatile the water levels are. It's a flood control reservoir, so it can swing by up to 50 feet in a dry year from top and bottom elevation. And yet it's still ringed with luxury homes, marinas, vacation rentals, etc. And really, the real estate there has been exploding since the early 2000s. Then we got the Lake Ray Hubbard in Dallas. This was built in 1969. That's to serve the city of Dallas. The city actually annexed the lake to itself to maintain control over its own water supply. Today, the area is like Rockwall and Heath surrounded and have turned it into like this booming community. There's still large amounts of development going on. If you're driving on 30 through Rockwall, you'll see it out on that peninsula there. Then we have Lake Texoma. That's on the Oklahoma border. That was formed by damming the Denizen Dam on the Red River. in 1940s. It's one of the few lakes that was has federally licensed private docks, and that really increased the value of the surrounding land. It's also one of the few places where you'll find striped bass that reproduce naturally, which is a big draw for fishers. Then a couple of the smaller ones. We have Lake Marble Falls. That's only 600 acres. That's tiny in comparison to a lot of the neighboring lakes. But it's still a part of the Highland Lake system. It's been a hidden gem for investors because of its charm, its elevation, and its proximity to Austin, which, if you're in Texas, you know people love moving there. Then you got Lake Granbury. That's a narrow, sort of winding lake that's southwest of Fort Worth, and it's created by damming the Brazos River, and that's in the 1960s. You'll see a lot of these are kind of around the same time frame. This kicked off a huge real estate boom in Hood County. Developers created canals and water access communities that helped Granbury become one of the fastest growing small towns in the state. Then we have Possum Kingdom Lake. That's built in the 1940s. This lake is famous for the Hell's Gate Rock Formation. It's deeper and cooler than most Texas lakes with clear water that makes it a popular weekend getaway for people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And in the early 2000s, it was home to an aggressive land development campaign with luxury cabins, lots, and even condos that run along the shoreline. So that's kind of just basically covering some of the lakes. But one of the things that's most interesting to me is actually the dams and the dam technology that goes into a lot of these. So I wanted to cover the 3 most common dams that you're going to find in Texas. The first one is the concrete gravity dam. These rely on their just sheer mass of concrete to hold back the water. A great example is the Mansfield Dam, which created Lake Travis, and that was built in the 1930s and finished in 1942. It's 278 feet tall and nearly 7,000 feet long. It holds back hundreds of billions of gallons of water. It's always insane to me that 80 years ago, they were building these giant structures that would seem like even a huge, daunting task now. Then you're going to encounter some earth fill, or what's called embankment dams. These are made from compacting earth, usually just dirt in lifts, as well as rock. They're cheaper and they work really well in like the wide flat areas, like around Lake Livingston. They created the Livingston Dam there. It's an earth fill structure that was completed in 1969. And these are the most common ones that you're going to see in East and South Texas. And then we have the concrete arch dams. These are less common in Texas due to our flatter topography, but you'll find some hybrid structures in Central and West Texas where the terrain gets a little hillier. But what's important for land investors to know is that the type of dam affects the lake stability and the water level fluctuation. I have actually invested around dried lakes, and that's not very good. So you want to invest in areas where the water level is going to be relatively stable. Earth-filled dams typically have less flexibility in water release, while concrete dams like the Mansfield are part of a larger hydroelectric or flood control system. So levels can change dramatically. So here's a little bit about how these dams are created. I'm going to highlight a couple. Most of the Texas's major dams were built between the 1930s and the 1970s, and this was part of the New Deal era infrastructure efforts, which a lot of people don't know. A lot of these were federally funded, and later through state or regional water development projects. Some of the key players were the Lower Colorado River Authority, the LCRA for short. They built a chain of lakes known as the Highland Lakes, including Lake Travis, Lake Buchanan, Inks Lake, and Lake LBJ. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they're responsible for dozens of the flood control lakes that are across the state, and that includes Lake Texoma as well as Lake Lavon. And then the Brazos River Authority, the Trinity River Authority, and the Sabine River Authority. These are also overseeing water bodies within their jurisdictions. And if you're investing in these areas, say you're buying land around these lakes, oftentimes when you go to get like a septic approval or something like that, these are the authorities that you actually have to go to get your septic permits. So I want to get a little more in depth here on how the real estate the real estate impacts of the dam controlled lakes. Okay, so We already talked about this a little bit, but lake level volatility can be an issue. So if you have lakes that are controlled by flood or power management, they can rise and fall fast. So these affect dock usage. They can affect erosion. So if you're like trying to maintain your water line, and they can affect the resale value as well. There's going to be shoreline management rules. So many river authorities are going to have strict setback rules and dock permitting processes, and even mowing regulations, because they do not want the erosion running into the water. You may have flood easements. So some of these properties near dams are within designated flood pools. So if you've worked in Texas, you're probably very familiar with these floodplains. That means that your land could legally be inundated during major storms. So water flowing up. So you want to always be checking your FEMA flood maps and your local floodplain ordinances. And this is also, again, going to affect your septic, because only certain septic systems are going to be engineered to be installed in floodplain. And another thing that folks don't really think about when they're buying into this area is spillways. So I actually was working with a buddy of mine who's a land investor, and he was looking at buying this large acreage property in Navarro County. And I pulled it up on the FEMA floodplain map, knowing that this can dramatically affect the value of the property. And what we noticed is about a quarter or a third of the property was in a spillway. So if that dam was to overflow, the runoff was going to run right through the property that they're intending to purchase. But every dam in Texas, whether it's concrete or it's earthfill, they have to deal with the possibility of too much water. So you're going to need to have a dedicated spillway. And it's basically just in case of emergency. It's a release valve to let all the water not all the water, but a lot of the water out of the lake so it doesn't blow the dam out. This is especially going to be during heavy rains, flash flood events, and the spillway channels that access downstream, they prevent the dam from overtopping or failing. Now, here's a few more issues around spillways. So there's a downstream risk, right? So if your land or your buyer's land is downstream of a spillway, you need to know about it. When the gates open, the water moves fast. These areas may not only flood, but they may wash away vast amounts of material, your dirt, your trees, homes, any sort of infrastructure that you may have built out there. So if you're in that zone, there's going to be development restrictions. There's going to be increased flood insurance. So if you're going to build a home in that area, your insurance rates are going to be higher. There's going to be potential infrastructure damage to your roads and fences, and even a loss of use of those areas during rainy seasons. And these rainy seasons are becoming more and more difficult. We're moving from predictable rainflow to much more drought and flood situation. So this definitely affects land value. But most lakes that are managed by river authorities or the Army Corps of Engineers are going to have detailed protocols, but not all releases are going to be announced in real time. This is especially true for smaller reservoirs. Some landowners have woken up to water rushing across their land after heavy rains upstream triggered a spillway release overnight. So with how much rain can fall at a single time, you may not have a lot of notice before you are in the thick of it. So this definitely affects land use. Let's say you're evaluating a tract just below Lake Whitney or Lake Louisville. If it's within the inundation zone for the spillway, this land may be discounted. You may see it as cheap. You may be like, this is a great deal. I got to buy this. But only to find out later it's because of this inundation zone. So you'll want to pull the flood pool elevation from the lake authority and compare it to your land's elevation using a topo map or some GPS data. And then there's going to be maintenance and failure risks. So not only are they going to potentially intentionally release water, but you're in a zone where if there's a failure, you could get smoked. So spillways like dams, they age over time. We've actually seen some of these big maintenance issues going on in major projects around Texas. But poor maintenance, debris buildup, or erosion can compromise the safety of the dam system. In extreme cases like Lake Dunlap in 2019, an aging spillgate failed, and the draining of the lake happened in minutes, wiping out nearby properties. These landowners were suddenly looking at lakefront lots with no lake. That's not a good situation to be in. So some of the investor tips that you really want to pay attention here is when you're scouting land near a dammed lake, especially below the dam, Is the property designated in a spillway or a flood pool zone? What's the flood history of the area? Oftentimes, you can actually just see this when you're out scouting the property. Keep an eye for evidence of large amounts of water flow or erosion. Does the local authority publish lake level and release spillway release info? This is something that oftentimes there's data that you can just find online. You want to find out if there's flood insurance that's required for this property. And then you want to know how often the spillway has been used in, say, the last 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. You can usually find a lot of this info just through the FEMA Flood Map Service Center, the local river authority or the water district, or just by asking some of the local civil engineers or surveyors that work in the area a lot. Again, just rely on some of the local population. Typically, they're going to know what's going on out there. All right. So next we're going to get into who really owns lakes, who governs them, who controls them, what it means for landowners, because this has major implications if you own property around lakes. So say you found yourself a beautiful property, lakefront property in Texas. It's quiet, it's got great views, and it backs right up to the water. You're already dreaming of building a dock, dropping a line in the water, maybe even starting a little Airbnb or short-term rental. But not so fast, because in Texas, most lakes are not owned by private individuals. They're owned, operated, and managed by public entities, and that has real consequences for how you can use the land around them. So who governs Texas lakes? Texas lakes are usually governed by one of the bodies, the river authorities. This is very common. The ones that you're going to hear a lot are going to be the Lower Colorado River Authority, the Brazos River Authority, the Trinity River Authority, and the Sabine River Authority, or the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority. You're going to run into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Don't you love those boys? They're responsible for Lake Lavon, Louisville, Lake Texoma, and Lake Georgetown. And then there's also city or county governments that manage some lakes, like Lake Ray Hubbard. And then there's even water supply districts or co-ops that have lakes that are under their control because they're using those as water sources for their lines. So why does this matter? Because there's a few things that you're going to have to talk to these entities with in order to gain access to. One of them is going to be your dock permits. So if you want to build a dock, you're going to need a permit. Someone's got to say, all right, go ahead, build a dock here. So some authorities are going to allow private docks like the LCRA, but others, especially the USACE, they're going to prohibit them entirely and require shared community docks. Others are going to have long wait lists. They're going to cap the number of permitted docks based on shorelines. And then they're also going to have standards for upkeep, how you can build them, how far out they can go, and even sometimes finished materials, how many boats. I mean, they can really get in depth on these. There's also shoreline ownership that plays a role here. In most cases, you don't actually own the water line. There's often a buffer strip of public land between your property and the lake. You may not be allowed to mow it, clear brush, or even walk a trail without a license or an agreement. In some lakes, like Lake Travis or Lake Buchanan, river authorities lease shorelines access for a fee. So your lakefront property might actually have an annual cost. So, something to watch out for. There's usually going to be zoning and development limits, so local lake authorities or city ordinances can impose strict setbacks, height restrictions, and bans on short-term rentals. Some lakes have building moratoriums if they're struggling with water quality, invasive species, or shoreline erosion. And then there's going to be water use rights. Surface rights in Texas are owned by the state. Even if you have a pump and you're right on the shoreline, you cannot legally draw water for irrigation, livestock, or even household use. And it's not easy to get permits for those. So a couple real-life examples. Lake Travis, they allow private docks, but they require permits, inspections, and registration. These are great for vacation rentals. Whereas Lake Ray Hubbard does not allow any private docks. There's strict shoreline use rules, and there's much more natural and less developed. That's great for conservation, but not so great for investors who are trying to get some cash flow out of it. So a couple major takeaways here. Before you buy any lakefront land in Texas, ask who governs the lake. Do they allow private docks? Who owns the shoreline? Who has authority over it? Are there any special zoning restrictions, easements, or water use rules that you need to be aware of? And does the lake have a shoreline management plan that is going to affect you? All right. And a little bit here on how lakes drive the value of land and development. So as soon as there's reservoirs that went in through Texas, land prices around the lakes jumped. All right, developers started buying up the cheap ranch land near the new water bodies and turned them into some communities, retirement communities, vacation home enclaves, suburban bedroom towns, and even like areas where people are just going to get a second home, a second lake home, sort of a vacation area, weekend getaway. And even some small lakes were created by private developers. So the lakes in those gated communities or resort-style subdivisions, those added massive value. So I've seen it firsthand. Like there's a 10-acre lot with no water access that might sell for like $75,000. But if you have lake frontage and dock accessibility, that can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we're not talking a small difference in value here. But there's a little bit of a twist. Most of these man-made lakes are technically owned by the state or local river authorities like we talked about before. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the cost of water, sort of between the past and the present. So historically, water in Texas has been cheap, dirt cheap in most rural areas, and even free in some cases if you had groundwater rights. That made land cheap too, especially if you had well or access to a lake. But over the past 2 decades, we've seen a steady increase in water rates, especially in cities and counties where the supply is tight and distribution is aging. For example, Austin water rates have nearly tripled since 2000, and rural water co-ops have raised rates to maintain infrastructure, and some investors are realizing that land with no secure water access might not be the bargain it once seemed. We've seen this firsthand ourselves, but also for some of our other friends who are land investors in the area, where they've actually gone through the process of acquiring land and platting a subdivision only to find out from the local water co-op that they do not have the infrastructure to service that property. So here's kind of the breakdown of today's water challenges. So first, population growth. There has been a huge influx of people through Texas, especially in Central Texas and North Texas. Everybody that's moving in is going to need water, and we're already in a situation where we're straining our current infrastructure. There's also drought cycles. Whether you think climate change is man-made or not, whatever it is definitely affecting how much water is falling from the sky and at what rate. So we are having less water overall, but also a difference in the regularity of that water. So we go through more drought and flood type of water events, rain events. So there's no reliance on groundwater. So many areas, especially out in West Texas, they depend on aquifers like the Ogallala, which are being depleted very fast. And they can recharge, but we're using it faster than they are recharging. We also have aging infrastructure. So some of the pipelines, pumps, and treatment plants are decades old. So there's a lot of loss through leakage and also just causing issues where some of these water lines are failing and we may not even be aware of it. So how much water is just being wasted through cracked joints, etc. Then there's legal complexity. Surface water is state-owned, but groundwater is what's called rule of capture in Texas, meaning if you can pull it out, it's yours. So this creates major uncertainty and makes planning very difficult. And we're going to get into what they're doing in today's day and age to deal with this. But let's get a little bit more into rule of capture. So it's one of the quirkiest legal doctrines in Texas. If you pump it, you own it. Texas follows the rule of capture when it comes to groundwater, meaning water is located beneath the surface of your land like in an aquifer. As long as you can drill a well on your property and the water stays underground until it hits your pipe, it's yours to use, even if you're sucking water from underneath your neighbor's land. Kind of funky. This means landowners in Texas have very broad rights to pump groundwater without needing permission from the state. So let's say you buy a 20-acre lot in West Texas and you drill a well into the Ogallala Aquifer. You start pumping water for cattle and even for a small subdivision. Your neighbor's well is 500 feet away and it suddenly dries up. Under the rule of capture, you are not liable. So you can completely drain your neighbor's well if you want to. But there is a catch. The capture is not a free-for-all. So Texas may honor the rule of capture, but the local groundwater conservation districts can regulate well spacing, depth, and total pumping capacity. Some districts require permits, reporting, and even metering on private wells. So if you pump water in a way that causes subsidence or ground sinking or waste, you could face legal pushback. And in areas where there's no groundwater district, you're basically in the Wild West. You can do whatever you want out there. So, why this matters to real estate investors? Well, water adds value, right? Obviously, a huge amount of value. If you buy land with a strong well or the ability to drill one, you've added long-term utility and resale value, hence the topic of this video. And due diligence is key. If the land is in a groundwater conservation district, you're going to want to know about it because it will definitely affect the way that you're going to use that property. You're going to want to know how deep the neighboring wells are. Usually we'll just get in touch with someone who actually drills wells in the area to find out from their experience how things are going. You want to know what the flow rate is, what the recharge rate is in the aquifer, and are there any pumping limits or moratoriums that you need to be aware of. And really, just in general, be a good neighbor. Don't try to drain your neighbors. All right, so I mentioned it before, but there are what's called a lot of water co-ops in Texas. What is a water co-op? So when you're buying land outside city limits, chances are your water isn't coming from some sort of big utility. It's coming from a water supply corporation or what's called a water co-op. These are nonprofit entities that deliver treated water to members, typically property owners in like rural subdivisions like I love to build, or unincorporated areas, or really just along county roads, FM roads out in the country. So, how are water co-ops set up? Water co-ops in Texas are usually established as nonprofit corporations under the Texas Water Code, Chapter 67. And this is how they typically work. They're formed either by residents or developers in an area that's not served by a city utility. They apply for a Certificate of Convenience and Necessity, a CCN, from the Public Utility Commission, the PUC, which gives them a legal service territory. This is usually funded through a mix of member buy-ins, monthly fees, and state or federal grants/loans like the USDA Rural Development Loans. They are typically owned by the property owners in the area, so it's like a true co-op model. The governance is usually a board of directors that are elected by the members, so the people that own property in the area. And the operations they contract are like water system operators. They hire licensed staff to handle the treatment, testing, metering, repairs, etc. Typically, a board would include somewhere like between 5 and 7 members that are volunteer. They meet monthly, and they're going to make all the decisions from what it costs to get the water, what it costs or what they're willing to pay for upgrading infrastructure, extending the lines, etc. Now, what they do to deliver the water is they usually are going to draw from groundwater wells or purchase water wholesale from a nearby city or a river authority. They're going to treat and store the water in above ground tanks, and then they're going to deliver it through a network of PVC or HDPE lines, often over miles of rural terrain. And they also sometimes are still using asbestos water lines, so that's something that you may want to see. They're going to use metered hookups just like any other utility. They're going to track the billage, and they're going to track the billing based on usage, and they are going to collect the money from the people that are using the water. There's usually going to be membership fees and equity buy-ins. So when you move into an area that is a water co-op, it may be a little different from the standard utility that you're used to in a city. You're required to be a member. You might have a one-time buy-in fee of like $100 to $500. Then there's going to be a meter installation fee that ranges from $1,500 to over $5,000, depending on the location, distance, trenching required, etc. And then some co-ops are going to require you to trench your own line from the road to your structure. So they might put it out at the road, and then you're responsible for what actually brings it up to your home. There's going to be a monthly usage fee that's going to be tiered. It's going to be usually like a $30 base and then $5 per 1,000 gallons. And it may fluctuate based on system maintenance needs, etc. And there can even be standby fees. So if you're not using your water, like on vacant land, some co-ops are still going to charge you a monthly availability or standby fee. So there are some challenges, though, with these small water co-ops. One of them, again, aging infrastructure. We're talking some of these are in the 60s and just have not really budgeted for major overhauls. There's limited capacity, so some of these co-ops are just not able to extend more meters, even though there's still a ever-growing demand for water in these rural areas. Oftentimes there's like this financial fragility that arises because they just don't have enough members, or they can't really charge enough to their members in order to maintain everything or really reinvigorate things as needed. And sometimes they're going to run into like inconsistent service. So there may be pressure fluctuations, boil notices, or outages. That's just really common out in these rural co-ops. So before you buy land in a rural water co-op, you're going to want to know, what's your water meter cost? Is there available capacity? Actually start with that one. What's the monthly base fee? Is there a tiered rate structure? Are there any recent or upcoming rate increases that you should be aware of? Are you going to be responsible for trenching your own line from the meter to your home? When was the water system last upgraded or expanded? And what is the water source? Is it groundwater, or is this going to be purchased surface water from another entity? And a quick pro tip for investors: small water co-ops can be a huge asset if they're well run, but a nightmare if they are underfunded or maxed out. So definitely get a good understanding of what a water co-op is able to do before you make any large purchases in that area. All right. Now, there are some long-term solutions that we need to be aware of, right? So conservation, right? If we're looking to solve this water problem, it's not really sexy, but it's efficient irrigation, drought-resistant landscaping, and smart water meters. It really helps stretch supply. We are near the ocean off of Lake Galveston, off of the the Gulf of America now, Galveston area, Houston area. So there is the possibility for desalination and reuse. Cities like El Paso are leading the charge on water reuse. Coastal destinations, desalination plants are also being proposed, but are expensive and very politically complex. I don't know if you know much about desalination, but there is a big issue where you pull water in, you pull a bunch of the salt out of the water, but then you have to put that salt somewhere. So oftentimes it's being pumped right back into the ocean, and it causes some difficulties for the marine life there. New reservoirs and infrastructure. I mean, this is what I think we ought to be focused on, but it's not simple. There are a few new lakes in the works. Wada Ark Lake out in Fannin County, but it's difficult to build. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of private landowners. I believe Texas is something like 99 or 98% public land. So in order for you to flood thousands of acres and build a new lake, I mean, you could be dealing with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of landowners that you need to negotiate with. Then there's aquifer storage and recovery sites, storing water underground in times of surplus to be used during a drought. This could be very valuable. And then just in general policy reform, like we need consistent long-term water planning at the state level. And some of this is happening, which we'll get into in a later episode. So I cannot stress enough, sort of in conclusion, I cannot stress enough how important it is for you to really understand the water infrastructure that is at your disposal when you're looking to make any sort of large investment in land in Texas, because this cannot be taken for granted. These resources can deplete. The infrastructure can be too old. The rates can be too high. You may not even have access, even if the neighbor has access to water. And that dramatically affects the value of your property. So I hope this was helpful for you. There's more to come where we're going to talk about what the state is currently doing, some new legislation that's being reviewed and actually recently approved. And I think it's sitting on Governor Abbott's desk to be signed. Until then, thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope this was informative and valuable for you. If you're looking to invest in the Texas market, now you know water is extremely, extremely important. We'll see you next time. Thank you.